Welcome to the Cheating Wife Stories channel. Have you ever heard the term seeing red and known what it means? I have, and I do. I saw red for the first and only time in my life that night. I guess I should probably introduce myself and give you some idea of what transpired to lead us to that moment when the red haze clouded my vision. For some background, my name is Stephen Harper, and my wife is Letitia Harper, formerly Letitia Martin. I've been dating others since high school. In spite of the fact that I dated a few girls before, I found myself drawn to her magnetically. It was like she had a hold on me that I didn't understand. Before I knew it, I had dumped my previous girlfriend. And the next day, I was asking Letitia Martin out. "Sorry, but I don't date white boys," she said with an apologetic smile. "Don't or haven't yet?" I asked with my most charming smile. "I have light sandy brown hair, green eyes, and I'm about as white as you can get." I knew from asking around that she had dumped her ex-boyfriend several weeks before and hadn't hooked up with another guy yet. My question caught her off guard, and she looked at me thoughtfully for a moment, sizing me up. I was wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and sneakers. I was a cornerback on the football team, so I was in shape. "Okay, Steve, is it? What did you have in mind for our date?" she asked, the beginnings of a smile starting to play across her lips. "Well, if that's a yes, then how about dinner and a movie? I know it's been done to death as a first date, but it's been done to death for a reason." "Okay, but I picked the movie," she said sternly. Her girlfriend, Lena, stood there and gawked as Letitia just accepted a date with a white boy. As I glanced at her, Lena smiled knowingly. I would find out later about the conversation they had. "Okay, fine, Tish. I think you should go for it," Lena said to her friend after Letitia confided that she was having second thoughts. "He is pretty fine for a white boy, but what will my folks say?" she asked. "You know how traditional they are. Just because you and Mitch are doesn't mean the rest of us sisters have the same type of feelings for white guys. And you also know that closed minds are ignorant minds. I'm not saying to marry him, but at least give him a chance," Lena said, her common sense and open-mindedness showing through. "I don't know, Lena." "Look, why did you dump Terry and Carl before him?" Lena asked. "Well, Carl was in a hole, and Terry was a cheating a hole." "Uh-huh. Now, there are some good brothers out there, but I've had similar experiences with them. If I wasn't with Mitch, I could see myself with a guy like Steve. I know he wouldn't cheat on me or hurt me." Lena explained her own views to her girlfriend. "Well, he's your best friend, so of course he wouldn't cheat on you." Letitia laughed. "I know it ain't the same situation you're in, but give Steve a chance. Who knows, you might just like it," she said with a wink. Letitia sighed. "Okay, well, could it hurt? But if he turns out to be a serial killer and kills me, I'm going to come back and haunt you." The two of them laughed as they entered their last class for the day. Letitia told me about that conversation after our third date, and I had just kissed her goodnight. As it turned out, we did hit it off. We had more in common than I thought. While I'm not a huge fan of hip-hop, I like her blues, and I love jazz. She isn't a fan of heavy metal, but that's fine by me. The movie we went to see on our first date was Guess Who with Ashton Kutcher and Zoe Saldana. It was an educational experience. She also told me a couple of years later, just before our wedding, that she wanted to see my reaction to some of the things said in the movie. I could see how some of the scenes might be uncomfortable for some, but I wasn't Ashton's character, and I had never cared about the color of someone's skin. It doesn't reflect the quality of their character, in my experience. 6 weeks after we started dating, I met her mom and dad. Up until then, I had picked her up for and dropped her off from our dates in front of her house. She'd warned me about their views on white people, but I finally told her that sneaking around behind their backs wasn't the way to go. I wanted her in my life, no matter what others might think. So we discussed it one afternoon while walking through the park, hand in hand, and finally agreed that I'd meet her folks first. Then she would meet mine afterward. Her parents were leery and suspicious of me at first, and I overheard her father saying that her being with me was akin to sleeping with the enemy. Letitia defended me, saying that I wasn't like some white guys, and I had to smile at that. Yes, I had fallen in love with her, and she had fallen in love with me. I won her folks over when I stood up to her father and told him, respectfully but in no uncertain terms, that I loved his daughter. I let my irritation at his dig show, and also told him that I wasn't going to be pushed out of her life by anyone but her. Letitia was the only one who could end our relationship, and I wasn't going anywhere. Her mother surprised me by giving me a hug, and I saw tears in her father's eyes as he accepted my impassioned declaration of love for his daughter. Even her older brother came around eventually. He'd been trying to set his sister up with one of his friends in the Marines, but she wasn't having it. My folks had a completely different reaction to Letitia, and it didn't take her long to win them over with her sweet personality, intelligence, charm, and steely determination. My sister, on the other hand, was skeptical. She didn't say anything right away, but she told me after I'd driven Letitia home that she hated my new girlfriend even more than she usually hated my girlfriends. "Why, Sally?" I asked. "You hate every girlfriend I've ever had. So what makes Letitia any worse than them in your view?" I pretty much knew the answer already. "Do I have to say it, Steve? Do I really have to say it?" she asked, fed up with my apparent denseness. "Does she have a dusky appearance?" It wasn't a question. She sighed. "Look, I have nothing against people, but they aren't good enough for me according to you." Once again, it wasn't a question. I'd heard my sister say similar words a few times in the last couple of years, but she had never said it in front of our parents. "Look, Sally, Mom and Dad never taught us to be bigoted. So where did you learn it from?" I asked. She was caught off guard by that question. "Well, all the crime." "Stop right there," I said calmly. "First of all, not all people can be judged by the way you are judging them. Think about it. Letitia and Lena were having a conversation shortly after I asked her out, and she thought I might be a serial killer. We had a good laugh about that after our third date, but that's another stereotype for you. Not all, but the majority of the notorious serial killers that have been in the news are like us. Is that a fair stereotype for all guys?" My sister hung her head as she carefully considered everything I just said. She finally looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "You're right, Steve. I'm sorry." I had to blink a few times at that. My little sister, barely a year younger than me, but always right, had just admitted for the first and probably only time that I was right about something and that she was wrong. But what was even more amazing was that she apologized to me. Instead of rubbing her nose in it, I decided to be a gentleman. "Thanks, Sally. Now please get rid of all those stereotypes in your head, because there's a good chance you might have her as your sister-in-law someday." Her eyes went wide at that statement. "You're thinking of marrying her?" There was more surprise than anger or resentment in her voice and expression. "If things keep going as they've been going, yes," I said with a smile. "I love her, sis." In response, she threw her arms around my neck and hugged me tight. "I just want to see you happy, bro. Don't screw this up." I didn't screw it up. We'd been dating for 3 months when she finally decided that we'd had enough of foreplay. That night, after watching the baseball game, we decided to drive up to the Bluffs. My shiny, pale gray 1968 Mustang Fastback 390 GT had a decent-sized backseat. So when we got there, we climbed into the back, and were all over each other. "I'm ready tonight if you are," she said with a smile after a long bout of kissing. I replied with a grin. "I've been ready, baby." "Let's do it, baby," she whispered, running her fingers through my hair as she kissed my lips over and over. "I can't wait anymore. I want you. Make love to me," she gasped. That was all the encouragement I needed to push forward. I'd been intimate a few times with an ex-girlfriend, but Letitia was something else entirely. It could have been the fact that I hadn't loved the girl I'd been with before, as that had been fueled more by hormones than emotional attachment. This time, I was in love, and I felt it in my heart and soul. Then she leaned down and whispered in my ear, "Now we're going to make love, baby." All these months of denying ourselves this final step, and now here we were. Our minds were focused on nothing but pleasure as our bodies took over, satisfying our mutual needs. I literally saw stars, and not because of the starlit sky above. My arms were still wrapped around her as I held her close, stroking her hair while my lips found her long, lovely, and sensuous neck. We just held each other close, enjoying the afterglow of our first time as lovers, our first of many times together for the rest of our lives. When we got to UCLA in the fall, we managed to keep our life together by getting an apartment off campus. With our scholarships and part-time jobs, we managed to make a living while getting our degrees. By the end of our sophomore year, we had enough for a small honeymoon after we were married. Our wedding happened on July 4th, so I wouldn't forget our anniversary. As Letitia put it, everyone should have fireworks on their anniversary, she had joked. In my humble opinion, Tish stayed on the pill so we wouldn't need protection. We both hated using it anyway. We always made time for each other, even after we were married. She got a degree in business while I went for what I've always liked: computers. A degree in computer science was a no-brainer for me. 2 years after our wedding, we graduated and entered the workforce. Letitia was hired at an advertising agency, and I was hired at a data entry firm to work on their internal and external servers. We got an apartment in Santa Barbara, and life was great for another 2 years. Sure, we had our occasional arguments, but nothing we couldn't discuss once our tempers had cooled. Every married couple has arguments. Anyone who says otherwise is lying through their teeth. We finally had the start of family talk, and we agreed that it was time. We'd both just been promoted, and Letitia went off the pill. Our new raises made it possible for us to put a down payment on a house, so we did. Our lovemaking was still as magical as that first time in the back of my Mustang. Yes, I still have that classic. If it had been painted Highland green, it would have been a dead ringer for the car that Steve McQueen drove in Bullitt. Dad even came clean after he bought it for me and helped me restore it, saying that he had convinced Mom to name me Steve after the actor. Yeah, he's a big fan. Instead, it was still painted the shiny pale gray color that I liked. So it came to pass that, almost 4 years after we were married, in the last week of June, to be exact, Letitia started getting sick in the mornings. At first, we thought she had a stomach bug, but when I took her to the doctor, he confirmed that she was pregnant. We were going to have our first baby. We celebrated that night with a lovemaking session. That night, I completely forgot about a discussion we'd had a few weeks before. Some guys at work had been coming very close to harassing Letitia. I would be reminded of it a week later, though, and not in a good way. It had started seemingly innocently enough. Letitia is somewhat of a flirt, but she knows when to cool it down. She isn't even flirty enough to be called flirtatious. She never makes promises like that. So guys know that she's only being friendly. Well, it seemed there was a group of 5 guys that she told me about who decided that she wasn't being friendly enough. When one asked her out, she told him no. She told him that she was happily married and that she loved me. He seemed to take it okay, but soon another one of his group asked her out as well. I remember getting a cold feeling in my gut. We'd had to deal with some a-holes in college who thought that every hot girl on campus belonged to them, regardless of relationship or marital status. Letitia had fought them off back then with minimal help needed from me. I'd had to fight one guy who wouldn't take no for an answer, and that had ended his dreams of stealing my wife. She told me their names and what they looked like. It looked like there were 5 of them. Darren Richards worked as one of the idea guys at the agency, a big dude. And he also had a bit of a reputation as a ladies' man. Larry Clayton was a guy who worked as a graphic designer. He thought of himself as God's gift to everything. From what I had gathered, Jack Sutter was another guy who seemed to be cut from the same cloth as his buddies. Jim Gables was the other big guy, and Jeffrey with a G. Gelman was the last guy. Jim, as it turned out, was the brains of their little group. As I would find out, they had all graduated together from USC, which automatically made me not like them. The UCLA and USC rivalry in the Pac-12 is one of the longest running in football history. We tend to call them the Rubber Trojans. Get it? Anyway, as it turned out, they had all been in the same frat in college. So, of course, they had to get hired together at the ad agency. Letitia was a project coordinator, so she had to oversee their work. That's what had started the whole asking her out on a date thing. At first, we just thought they were trying to score brownie points with her, despite the rings on her left ring finger. Little did we know. And now you're up to date. We were going to her company's Independence Day celebration, and we were already dressed for the party when I got the call to come in and fix the server. Letitia looked gorgeous in her emerald green party dress. We had already celebrated our anniversary. She got me a nice watch, and I got her a pair of silver earrings. We'd had the whole day off, of course, but then the call came from my boss telling me that he needed me to fix that damn server. Letitia was as annoyed as I was. "I can't believe that a hole," she declared, shaking her head in frustration. "I know, baby. It's probably something simple. You go on ahead. Just remember, no drinking." I smiled at the love of my life. "Club soda only, boo," she responded with a smile of pure love. "Go to work, but don't be too long." "Yes, baby," I replied, kissing her sweet lips. So, while I drove back to the office in my fast car, Letitia drove her Prius to the party. It was being held at her boss's mansion, and we'd both been there before. I knew exactly where it was. The work on the server itself took me an hour and a half. Not too bad, though I knew they could have taken care of it themselves. They just wanted to scoot when I showed up to do the actual work, but I bit the bullet and did it. When it was done, I tested it and was out the door. I called my boss and told him not to call me for the rest of the weekend. After I explained everything about what was wrong with the server, he was almost as pissed off as I was. He knew that Harvey and Joe could have done the job too. He apologized for not making them do it, and we ended the call. As I got into my car, I texted Letitia to tell her I was done and on my way. I also apologized for the delay. I got no reply. That didn't sit well with me. Letitia always replied immediately when I sent her a text. We hadn't had an argument, and she said she understood that I had to work. I started the big V8 engine and pulled out of the parking lot. When I didn't hear back from her after 10 minutes, I decided to call her. Her phone rang and rang, then went to voicemail. Now I knew something was wrong, so I put the hammer down and hit redial. This time, it went straight to voicemail without even ringing first. I'd already had a bit of a cold feeling in my gut, but now that cold feeling had spread to my chest too. 10 minutes later, I pulled up to the mansion gate and announced myself over the intercom. The gate buzzed and slid open for me, and I squealed the tires as I drove up the long driveway. Once I was parked, I jumped out and sprinted for the door. It opened before I got there, and I forced myself to slow down. It was hard to do since I was damn near in a panic already. Maybe her battery died. No, she'd charged it all day like usual. When we were home, we always kept our phones on the chargers. I forced myself to breathe as I walked in, scanning the crowd of guests for my wife. I didn't see her, nor did I see the 5 holes. The cold pit had spread to my legs and arms now, but I somehow held it together. I asked some of her coworkers if they'd seen Letitia recently. One had, apparently, until I reached Cindy Newton. "Hey, Cindy, do you know where Letitia is?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice and failing miserably. "Oh, I saw Jim and Jack helping her to a bedroom to lie down," she said, scanning the crowd, looking for the missing frat brothers. "Which bedroom?" I asked, my voice suddenly bone-chillingly cold. Cindy caught my tone, and the look on my face must have been something out of a nightmare. The way she was looking at me, Her face paled. With a shaking hand, she pointed, and I followed her finger. I can't really explain the change that came over me in that moment. It was like a switch was flipped in my mind. The adrenaline I had been feeling since Letitia didn't reply to my text was now working for me instead of making me shake. I felt strangely calm as I walked quickly to the door she indicated. When I got there, I tried the handle, and it was locked. Without even thinking, I kicked the door hard, and the latch gave way as the door slammed inward, bouncing off the wall. The first thing I saw was the 5 naked men. Then I saw Letitia, obviously unconscious, lying on the bed. Jim was assaulting her. That was when the red haze descended over my vision. The only actual thought running through my head was Revelation 6-8. As my body took over, it was like my higher thought process had shut down, leaving only an avenging demon in its wake. Jim was the first to fall as I slammed my fist into his surprised face. He had been so caught up in assaulting my wife that his brain hadn't even bothered to register it when I kicked in the door. The others were quicker to act, and I found myself in the fight of my life. Blood was pounding in my ears as I lashed out at anything male and naked. Larry fell next when I kicked him right in the jewels. The rest became a blur. Then the blur finally faded, and the red haze cleared from my eyes. I collapsed onto the bed beside the unconscious body of my wife. It was then that I registered the screams, shouting, and other sounds emanating from the house outside the room. I looked, and there were 5 naked men lying on the floor in various states of disrepair. A couple of them were out cold, while the other 3 were moaning and holding various body parts. Then all hell really broke loose as the cops and EMTs arrived. Someone must have called 911, and it barely registered in my brain when the cops handcuffed me and forced me down onto the floor. I didn't resist since I was already bone-tired from the fight. "He's her husband, and those men were assaulting her," Cindy shouted. God bless her. It occurred to me that she must have followed me to the bedroom door and had probably seen the whole thing. I realized that I couldn't see out of my right eye, and other parts of my body were hurting like hell too. The next thing I remember was being put on a stretcher, or gurney, or whatever. My wife. I croaked the question to the nearest EMT. "She's being taken in another ambulance, sir. We'll get you both to the hospital ASAP," he said with a reassuring smile. Thank God. I sighed as the injection they gave me took hold, and I was feeling no pain. I awoke in a hospital bed. "Doctor." "He's awake," the nurse yelled when she saw that my eye was open. She rushed out of the room to find the doctor, who hadn't come running when she'd yelled. They both came in as I was attempting to get out of bed. "Mr. Harper, I'm Dr. Layton. This is Nurse Hatcher. You need to calm down and rest," the doctor said as he and the nurse gently pushed me back down on the bed. "Water," I croaked. My throat was drier than Death Valley. "Right away, sir," the nurse said as she went and filled a large Dixie cup. When she handed it to me, I downed it in 2 huge gulps. Then I was able to talk. "Is my wife okay?" I asked, my voice still a little hoarse. I had to know. She hadn't even moved that I knew of when I'd been fighting the a-holes. But then, I didn't know much of anything after kicking Larry in the nuts. The doctor paused for a moment as if choosing his words carefully. "She'll be fine, eventually. She had a large dose of narcotics in her system." "It's date rape," I interrupted. "How large a dose?" "Enough to potentially kill her if we hadn't flushed out her system," he said stoically. "We got her cleaned out, though. They've also done a rape kit on her, and it came back positive for male DNA. I promised not to drink." I slurred my words slightly. Apparently, I was on some pain meds that were dripping into the IV line. "We found no traces of alcohol in her system, Mr. Harper. I have some bad news, though," he said, his voice trailing off. The cold pit in my gut returned as I saw his concerned and sympathetic expression. Before he even said it, I knew, and I felt the tears rolling down my face as the next words came out of his mouth. "I'm sorry, sir, but your wife lost the baby. I've never had much of a temper, until now." Sure, I'd been angry before, but nothing had ever pushed me into a murderous rage until this incident. Those so-called men had assaulted my wife, drugged her enough to kill her if she hadn't received medical attention in time, and now they had murdered our unborn child. The only thought in my mind at that moment was how I was going to kill the sorry pieces of garbage who'd done this to my wife and child. I had decided on doing it slowly and very painfully. This time, I pulled the IV out of the back of my hand and sat up in bed. I swung my feet over the side as the doctor and his nurse tried to stop me. "Let me go," I said, my voice dropping to sub-zero temperatures. "Get an orderly and call the detective. Get them in here," the doctor said to his nurse as he tried to restrain me himself. At the mention of a detective, I stopped struggling. "Doctor, I just want to know where my wife is. I need to see her," I said, forcing myself to calm down. Anger, concern, and sadness were warring in my head. I had to see my wife. I had to hold her in my arms. "She's still unconscious, but she should be awake in the morning," he said in a placating voice. "You have a mild concussion, your right eye is swollen shut, and you have 1 cracked rib, 4 bruised ribs, as well as bruises on your arms, legs, and back. And I need to see my wife, Doc," I replied as evenly as I could under the circumstances. Just then, the nurse returned with an orderly and the detective. The orderly wasn't needed anymore, so he left. The detective stood there as I told the nurse not to replace the IV drip. "But Mr. Harper, the pain," Dr. Layden started. "I can deal with the pain, Doc," I replied evenly. "Nurse, could you please excuse us? I need to talk with Mr. Harper alone," the detective said in a professional tone. The doctor and nurse just nodded, admonishing him to go easy on me since I had been badly injured, and left the room. Nurse Hatcher said to hit the call button if I needed anything, and I thanked her for that. "Mr. Harper, I'm Detective Rains. I'm here to talk with you and take your statement. Are you feeling up to it?" he asked as he sat in the chair next to my bed, still in a professional and even tone. I had to respect his professionalism and just nodded at his inquiry. "Thank you. Now I'll be recording this, so please tell me the circumstances surrounding what went on before you arrived, and what precipitated the events in the bedroom at Mr. and Mrs. Walker's house." So I told him my side of what went on. I didn't embellish it, including the fact that I didn't remember much of anything after kicking Larry in the balls. My only concern at that time had been to defend my wife from further harm. I also told him what the doctor had told me about my wife's condition and how she had been poisoned with an overdose of narcotics, which caused her to lose our baby. "Am I going to be charged?" I asked finally as he stopped the recorder. California has some screwy laws about self-defense and defense of others. I wanted to make sure that I had options just in case I was charged too. "I don't think that will be necessary. I seriously doubt that any jury would convict you, and I've already recommended to the DA not to press charges," was his reply. "Thank you, Detective," I said with a genuine smile, the first since all this had happened. Rains was okay in my book. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "To tell you the truth, Mr. Harper, if I had found those men with my wife in that situation, I would have done the exact same thing that you did. As far as I'm concerned, you acted as any husband should and defended your wife to the best of your ability." He then got up to leave. Oh, and I would hate to be them right now. The DA's throwing the book at all 5 of them, since there were plenty of eyewitnesses, and Mr. Walker is doing his damnedest to avoid any kind of lawsuit you might pursue against him or his company. Also, the toxicology and assault kit done on your wife came back positive, and it looks like a slam dunk. "Thank you, Detective. If you need me to testify, I'll be glad to," I said, shaking his hand. With that, he left the room, leaving me to my own thoughts. I hit the call button for the nurse, and she got to my room in less than a minute. "Yes, Mr. Harper," she asked. "Are you in pain, or is there anything I can do for you?" "I would like to see my wife, please," I said. Yes, I was in pain. A lot of pain, to be exact. The fact that it was emotional pain more than physical pain didn't matter. I just had to be with my wife. "One moment, sir. They'll check with the doctors over in critical care. I'll be right back," she said with a sympathetic smile as she walked out the door. I checked the clock on the wall and saw that it was after 2 a.m. I'd gotten to the party around 8 p.m., just before the fireworks were slated to start, and here it was, over 6 hours later. The doctor and nurse came back into my room together. "Mr. Harper, it's pretty irregular to have visitation this late," he said. "She's my wife, doctor. I need to see her with my own eyes. I need to be there when she wakes up. I'm going to need a bit more than this damn hospital gown, though." "Where are my clothes?" I said. "Your clothes had to be cut off of you to assess your injuries when you arrived. But we can get you some scrubs to wear," Nurse Hatcher said. "I'll be right back with some." As she left the room, Dr. Layden came over and sat by my bed in the same chair Detective Raines had just vacated. "Mr. Harper, do you mind if I call you Steve?" he asked. "Be my guest," I shrugged. "Steve, I realize that you've been through a very trying ordeal, as has your wife. You both should make a full recovery," he was saying, but I had to interrupt him. "They killed our baby, doctor," I said, my voice once again dipping below freezing. "I hope you're right about a full recovery. But that little life never had a chance to live." "I see your point," he said, looking down with a pained expression on his face. "If you were planning to talk me out of going to my wife's room and spending the night there, you can forget it. Judging by the ring on your finger, you're married too. If you and your wife were in this situation, what would you do?" I asked. He just gave me a look of determination and said, "I'd do exactly what you want to do. I won't say no." I nodded as I got out of bed and went into the restroom. I had to relieve my bladder, and when I looked in the mirror, I could see just how much of a mess I was. I had a cold bandage over my right eye, and my face was bruised all over. I tried to think back to the brawl, but I had no idea how I'd received all those bruises. I hadn't felt any pain while it was going on, probably from the adrenaline coursing through my system, but now I could feel everything. My ribs were taped up, and I had bandages on my left shoulder and arm. I also had bandages on my hands, and I considered myself lucky that I hadn't broken any knuckles while beating those assholes senseless. They were sore as hell, though. As I exited the bathroom after finishing my business, I was met by Nurse Hatcher with some scrubs for me to wear. She smiled sympathetically as she handed them to me, and I thanked her with a smile of my own as I stepped back into the restroom to change. It took a while, as I was stiff as a board from the fight. Yes, I kept in shape since high school, but the human body isn't meant to take the kind of beating I'd suffered. I was bone and soul tired, and I ached like hell. But nothing was going to stop me from visiting my wife. "She's in room 311, sir," said the nurse manning the station at the critical care ward. "Dr. Layden called ahead to let us know that you were on your way." It had taken me a while to get there, as I wasn't moving as fast as normal. Big surprise, right? When I looked in the room, it was mostly dark, but I could make out Letitia lying on the bed with the machines hooked up to monitor her vitals. The IV drip was inserted into the back of her left hand, so I moved to her right side. I pulled up a chair and sat down, holding her hand in mine. "You're going to be okay, baby," I said even as the tears rolled down my face. Her face in sleep looked peaceful. I was pretty sure that she didn't know yet that she'd lost our baby. I couldn't blame her for that. I couldn't blame her for anything that had happened earlier that night. I blamed myself, though. I blamed myself almost as much as I blamed those assholes who'd done this to her. If I'd just told my boss to go screw himself and gone to the party with her instead, I knew they wouldn't have had a chance to get to her. Once again, I couldn't stop the tears that fell from my eyes as I laid my head down on the edge of the bed, near where I was holding her warm hand. Our fingers were interlaced, and I fell asleep like that. I was where I should, and needed, to be. True to the doctor's prediction, Letitia awoke in the morning. When she moved, it woke me up too, as our fingers were still interlaced from the night before. Her eyes weren't quite focused yet, but when they did register on my face, she gasped. "Steve," she croaked. "Don't speak, baby. I'll get you some water," I said, then tried to stand and get the pitcher and a cup. She kept hold of my hand, her face a mask of worry. Then it occurred to me that my own face was bruised and bandaged. "Sweetheart, they'll explain this in a moment. Right now, you need water, okay?" Finally, even though her worried look didn't change, she whispered, "Okay," and let go of my hand. I smiled, then poured her a cup of water from the pitcher in her room. "Okay, boo, what's going on? Why am I in the hospital? But more importantly, what happened to your face?" she asked once she'd finished gulping down the water. I took a deep breath. "Honey, what all do you remember from the party last night?" "Well, I got to the party and talked to some friends. Cindy helped me keep those idiots at bay. And Jim finally came over and offered to get me a refill on my club soda. He called it a peace offering, and I accepted it. Cindy went to dance with her boyfriend, and I started sipping the soda. After that, it gets really fuzzy, and then I must have blacked out." She had a really worried look on her face now that she was recounting what happened. "They spiked your drink, sweetheart," I said in a choked voice of my own. My anger was returning, stronger than before. "What time was it when Jim handed you the drink?" "I think around 7:30 or so," she said. She could tell by the look and condition of my face that something was seriously wrong. "What happened, Steve?" she asked, her voice near panic. I took a few deep breaths to calm myself. I closed my good eye and finally looked at her. "Sweetheart, Jim, Jack, Larry, Darren, and Jeffrey are all in jail right now, and they're charged with assault." "Oh my God," she said, then started crying. "Did they?" "Yes," I said in a barely audible whisper. "When I got out of the office, I tried texting you but got no reply. So I tried calling you. It rang a few times, but then went to voicemail. When I tried calling you a second time, it went straight to voicemail. So I believe one of them turned your phone off. When I got to the party, I found Cindy, and she said that Jim and Jack had helped you to a bedroom to lie down since you weren't feeling well." I had to pause to keep from exploding. I once again took a few deep breaths before continuing. Cindy and I looked around for the 5 assholes, but none of them were in the main room. When I asked her which bedroom they took you to, she pointed, and I went looking. The door was locked, so I kicked it in. "Jim." I had to stop, recounting it. It was hard enough to tell Detective Rains, but telling my wife that she'd been assaulted was even more difficult. She put her hand to the side of my face and stroked my cheek, wiping away a tear. "I thought it was all a nightmare," she said in a haunted tone. Before I blacked out completely, I felt someone rip my clothes off. Her voice trailed off as she broke down in sobs. I moved up onto the bed beside her and held her close as she cried into my shoulder. "Mr. and Mrs. Harper," I heard a nurse say from the doorway. We both sniffled, and I turned to look at her, still keeping my arms around Letitia. "Yes," I said. "There's a detective here to see you," she said with a tentative smile. "She wishes to speak to your wife if she's up to it." I looked at Letitia. "Are you up to it, baby?" I asked gently. Letitia sniffled again and nodded. I could see her steeling herself for what was to come. A doctor came in right after the detective and said that he had to tell Letitia something before Detective Hart could interview her. He looked at me and saw our fingers interlaced as I moved to sit next to her on the bed so I could face them all too. "Mr. and Mrs. Harper, I'm Dr. Alino, and I'm afraid I have some bad news for you," he said in a soft and sympathetic tone. "Mrs. Harper, due to the stress placed on your body by the narcotics you were given last night, I'm afraid that you had a miscarriage." He said it in a soft and sympathetic tone, but unfortunately, his tone of voice didn't help as Letitia turned and buried her face in my chest. She threw her arms around me and cried even harder. I'd already heard it from Dr. Layton, but that didn't help much as I held my wife close. "I'm really sorry for both of you," he said before leaving the room. "It's going to be okay, baby. I love you, and I'm not going anywhere," I said in a soft voice, but with conviction in my words. "They will pay for what they did to you. They killed our baby," she said in a shuddering voice. "They didn't care that I was pregnant. They went ahead and drugged me anyway." "Wait, they knew?" I asked incredulously. Letitia nodded. "I made the announcement at work last week after we found out. They were all there, along with everyone else in the office." Then Letitia turned to Detective Hart. "Put them away forever," she snarled, the tears burning in her eyes and rolling down her cheeks. I turned her face to look at me. "Sweetheart, please calm down. The police and prosecutors have this one well in hand. When Detective Raines talked to me last night, he said that it was a slam dunk for the DA. We might have to testify, but at least we'll be able to help put them away if we need to," I assured her. "Right. We have more than enough evidence, but if you take the stand and testify to the effect that they drugged you after finding out that you were pregnant, we might be able to put them away for life," said Detective Hart. "Then I'll do it," Letitia replied with a stoic and steely look of determination that showed in her voice as well. I was released that day and had to take a cab back to the residence to pick up my Mustang. Bill Walker, Letitia's boss, informed me that they would keep Letitia's Prius safe until she came to collect it, and I thanked him. He was obviously nervous, but I assured him that I wasn't going to sue him or his company. He did, however, let me know something important. "Steve, you and Letitia are like family to us. But as for those assholes, they've already been terminated for cause. Just please be careful. Their families are very wealthy," he told me. "How wealthy?" I asked, my now familiar cold dread taking up residence in my gut again. "Much. Enough to send quite a few contracts my way in return for hiring their boys as employees," he said with a guilty look. "I swear to God, if I had known they were like that, I would have told their families to stick it up their butts." "Thanks, Bill," I replied, using his first name since he had told me to. We shook hands, and I started up my pale horse and drove out of there. They had to keep Letitia overnight again, so I drove home to get another change of clothes and to pick up some clothes for Letitia too. Once I had them packed, I drove back to the hospital and took the overnight bag up to her room. "Thank you, baby," she said with a strained smile as I set her bag down on the little couch in her room. "Anytime, beautiful," I replied with a smile of my own, then leaned in and kissed her softly. "I love you," I whispered. "I love you too, honey," she whispered back as we leaned our foreheads together. "Hey, when you get better, we can have another baby," I said, still whispering, but with a slight smile this time. I was still torn up inside, but until she rediscovered her inner strength, I would have to be strong for both of us. God knows she'd helped me through some tough spots in my life over the years, the death of one of my best friends being one of those times. She chuckled in spite of herself and the situation. "Yeah, we can, can't we? And with those assholes behind bars for the next 20 to 25 years, we won't have to worry about them ever again." I nodded sagely. She actually gave me her usual radiant smile that time. "That's one reason I love you, boo. You keep me from falling down, or if you can't catch me in time, you help me back up and hold me close." "Likewise, sweetheart," I replied, kissing her tenderly again. I stayed with her all that day. When the nurse came by to tell me that night that visiting hours were over, I told her that no force on earth was going to take me from my wife's side. I ended up sleeping on that little couch in her room, and so I was able to take her the next morning to pick up her Prius and then follow her home. Over the next 2 weeks, we helped each other through our emotional crisis. I just held her at night as we slept in each other's arms. When the indictment hearing came up for the 5 assholes, we attended, sitting side by side. We entered the courtroom expecting indictments to come down and planned to visit the DA to volunteer our testimony if necessary. Instead, Our nightmare became even worse. The 5 assaulters were given plea deals to lesser charges, including aggravated assault and several other misdemeanors, such as distribution of a controlled substance. I felt my anger building with each slap-on-the-wrist sentence the judge handed down to all of the Staines who had assaulted my wife. None of them served more than 90 days in county jail. Letitia was crying as they filed out to serve their sentences, and we had to find comfort in the fact that they now had a criminal record and would find it very difficult to find work after they got out of jail. Then Jim, the leader of the assault gang, leaned over to where we were sitting and leered at my wife. "This ain't over, witch. We're going to do it again before it's all over, and you won't have anyone coming to rescue you this time." Before I could even think, I jumped up and decked the sorry scumbag so hard I felt teeth give way to my knuckles. My hands and face had healed up, and my ribs, while still tender, were feeling a hell of a lot better than they had 5 weeks before. The next thing I knew, bailiffs were restraining me, and I glared at Jim as he was led out of the courtroom. His final glare told me that this wasn't over by a long shot. My glare right back told him that he was right. After spending 3 days in jail for misdemeanor assault, I was released. I had pled no contest to the charges, and the judge, luckily, was sympathetic enough to give me the bare minimum sentence. Yes, it was a different judge than the one who had handled the assault case. After about a month, things got back to normal at home. Well, as normal as they could get after what we'd been through. We both went back to work, but speaking for myself, I did the bare minimum necessary to keep my boss off my back. "Baby, we need to talk," Letitia said one evening after we finished eating dinner. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I replied, the sadness and despair coming back again. It was like a barely scabbed-over wound. One little pick at it, and it started bleeding again. Her expression was soft and loving, but I hadn't noticed that with the words she'd spoken. "No, baby, you have no reason to be sorry. Here, I'm the one who should apologize," she said. "I love you, Steve. I know you love me, and I love you too. I think I'm ready tonight. I need you." She smiled, and the relief that washed over me almost made me miss the meaning of her words. "You mean?" I asked, a smile growing on my lips. "Yes," she replied. We'd spent almost 2 full months without having intimacy, and I, for one, was excited as hell. I could tell by her body language that Letitia was also excited, more than she'd been in the past 3 months. There was also a practical reason for that. The possibility of at least one of the 5 assaulters having an STD was enough for Letitia to get a full battery of tests done, including the new HIV test that can detect the virus within 30 days. Luckily, and I thank God every night, my wife was 100% clean. Also, luckily, she didn't remember much of the assault itself, having passed out from the drug they'd given her. So we made love that night, long and slow, multiple times. We reaffirmed our love for each other that night, and the next day. I rolled off of her, and she just looked at me with glazed eyes, grinning. I grinned back, and if it hadn't been for the grumbling in our stomachs, I think we would have gone again, or at least tried. We made breakfast and ate in silence, smiling at each other, and finally laughing as our grins grew bigger. When we returned to bed after breakfast and a shower, where we washed each other's backs, she finally said something. "I want us to try again to have a baby. Do you still want to?" "Always, beautiful," I responded as I held her close and kissed her lips softly. The first to be released from jail was Jeffrey Gelman. According to the police reports, he had voiced some concerns to his frat brothers about the whole plan to drug my wife and had objected to them assaulting her. However, he had gone along with it in the end. I took a month's vacation from work, mostly to spend time with my wife, but one day was set aside for me time. I hadn't forgotten what they'd done, and I would never forgive them for it. The slap-on-the-wrist sentences had been a sting, a slap in the face to my wife and me. Oh, that judge was going to get his too. But first, Jeffrey with a G. Gelman. He had a meeting with the Pale Rider. Tracking him was easy. He still had his apartment, paid for with Mommy's money. Since he was now out of a job, he never saw me coming when I hit him with the stun gun. He fell like a sack of potatoes and twitched on the floor. It was fairly easy to handcuff him to a chair by his ankles and wrists. I then found a pair of used underwear from his hamper and stuffed the tidy whities in his mouth. Once he was secured, a calmness came over me. I knew I was crossing the line, but justice had been denied for too long. It took a few more minutes for him to come around. He took only a few seconds to assess his situation, and when he saw me sitting in a chair turned backward, leaning forward over the back of it, he froze. "Welcome back, Jeffrey," I said in a voice that could freeze molten lava. When recognition dawned on him, he started struggling against the cuffs and trying to say something around the racing stripe undies in his mouth. "Shut up and listen, asshole," I growled. When he stopped trying to talk and was looking at me with abject terror in his eyes, I continued. "This is what's going to happen. If you want to walk out of here alive, you will do exactly what I say when I say it. Do you understand?" He nodded his head frantically. "Good. I know that you objected to how your frat brothers treated my wife. That means something. However, you participated in her assault. That also means something, and the scales of justice need some balance. Don't you agree?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He was just staring into my implacable eyes as he slowly nodded his head. "Good man," I said, my voice still emotionless. With God as my witness, it took every ounce of self-control I had not to rip his head off right then and there. But I needed him. "Here's the deal, Jeffrey. You now work for me. Your paycheck for being employed by me is another day of life. As you can see, I'm wearing latex gloves, and there will be no DNA or fingerprint evidence that I was even here. I also have an airtight alibi, just in case you want to report me to the cops after our little meeting concludes. If you do that, I will come back and kill you without any qualms whatsoever. You could say that working for me is a win-win for you. You get to live another day." I paused to let him digest what I had just told him. At his tentative nod, I stood up and moved in front of him. "I'm going to remove your gag now. If you scream, I'll kill you. Do you understand?" At his nod, I pulled the undies out of his mouth. "What do you want me to do?" he asked once he was able to speak. "Right now, I want you to tell me exactly how you and your friends managed to get plea deals when the evidence was overwhelming and potential eyewitness testimony would have been a slam dunk for the DA. I said, my voice once again colder than the Arctic Circle. "One of the prosecutors in the DA's office is from our sister sorority. Jim contacted her and asked her to convince the DA that this was all a big misunderstanding," he blurted. "Which one?" "Amanda Ramirez," he said. I wrote her name down for future reference. "So Miss Ramirez somehow convinced the DA that the case might not be strong enough?" I asked. "Yeah. Don't ask me how, but she did it," he said with a shrug. "Okay. Which one of your friends gets out next?" I asked. "Darren, Jack, and Larry get out in 2 weeks," he said with some trepidation. "Jim is the only one serving the full 90 days, since he was the mastermind and took full responsibility." "Well, wasn't that nice of him?" I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. "If you say anything to any of them about this conversation, I'll kill you. Do you understand?" Yes, he stammered. "Good. Be advised, Jeffrey, I'm going to be keeping an eye on you. Now I'm going to take the cuffs off. Remember our deal. You work for me, and you get to live." "Questions?" I raised my eyebrow. "No, sir," he said. Yes, Jeffrey knew which way the wind was blowing. I got up and walked over to him. "Good," I said and hit him with the stun gun again. What can I say? I wasn't taking any chances that he might grow a spine. Once I'd cleaned up any trace that I'd been there, I left and made my way back to my car at the other end of the complex. When I got in and started the engine, I closed my eyes for a moment and thought about what I was doing. Some say that revenge is a vulture that picks at you until there is nothing left. There's an old saying that says, when you plan your revenge, dig 2 graves, one for your enemy and one for yourself. But sometimes, just sometimes, justice needs a helping hand. Letitia knew that I was planning something. I knew I couldn't keep it hidden from her forever, so I really didn't try all that hard. When she confronted me, it was an interesting conversation. "What are you planning, Steve?" she asked after dinner one night. "Justice, sweetheart." I hedged. She just gave me that look, so I sighed and forged ahead. "This isn't just about you and me anymore, baby. If I don't do something, what's to stop them from doing what they did to you to some other unsuspecting woman? What's to stop them from coming after you again? You heard Jim's threat in court after he was sentenced." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, even as a tear came to her eye. "Please, baby, what if you get caught?" she asked at length. "I'm taking every precaution I can to not get caught. I've already talked with Jeffrey a bit, and he now works for me." "It didn't take much to turn him against his former frat brothers," I said with a slight smirk. She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, that little snake would do anything to save his own hide. He was the first one to turn on the others, from what I heard from Malcolm." Malcolm Martin is Letitia's brother and a cop with the SBP, a former Marine. While he couldn't be directly involved with the case, he kept his ears open. Hell, it was his sister who'd been assaulted. And we buried the hatchet after he found out what I'd done to the 5 assholes at the party. What I didn't tell her was that very few, if any, of the assaulters would survive. I had planned it out and gone through different scenarios, taking into account anything and everything that might go wrong. In the 2 weeks following Jeffrey's release, I drafted a script for him to use when he contacted his frat buddies after they were released. I took it to him the day before they would be released from custody. "What's this?" he asked when I handed him the 2 pieces of paper. "This is what you're going to say when you call your frat brothers, Jeffrey," I said, my voice once again colder than the Arctic Circle. He looked at me perplexed. "You want us to plan revenge against you?" "No, I want you to follow the script. In 1 more week, Jim will be getting out too. That's when you follow the rest of the script." "Do you have it memorized?" I asked. It took 2 hours for him to memorize his lines, as well as the contingency lines I'd placed in there in case he was met by any resistance or arguments from his buddies. Once he was able to recite the lines verbatim 3 times in a row, I took the script back. "This stays with me," I said. "But what if I forget the lines?" He whined. "Write them down yourself if you want, but if you mess this up, I'll have to fire you." I intentionally put an ominous tone in my voice. He gulped. Okay, I'll do it. But once this is all over, we're good, right?" "I won't lie to you, Jeffrey," I said. "We will never be good, as you put it, no matter what. You assisted in the assault of my wife. Granted, you argued against it at first, but in the end, you went along with Jim's plan." He was a bit startled that I knew all of that. "How did you know?" "I know a lot of things. I also know that you rolled over on your frat buddies so fast it made the cops' heads spin. You really don't want them to find that out, do you?" I grinned. "For what it's worth, I'm really sorry I went along with what happened to Letitia. I'm sorry for what I did to her and to you. I've always liked her," he said. And I saw tears in his eyes that weren't there because I had threatened his life. "Well, you didn't like her enough to not go along with it. And you didn't like her enough to warn her that it was going to happen," I said, standing up and folding up the script to put in my pocket. "Save your apologies for someone who might forgive you, like God. Maybe forgiveness for what you've done is above my pay grade. Just remember, after you get them to meet with you, you call me and let me know that it's on." I didn't even wait for him to reply as I turned and left his apartment. When I got home from my Saturday afternoon visit with the a-hole, Letitia was waiting, pacing back and forth. "Baby, are you okay?" I asked as I saw the look of worry on her face. "I'm scared, Steve. Jim is getting out in a week, and I don't know what we'll do if he comes back," she exclaimed, then started to cry again. I held her close and gently stroked her back. "Sweetheart, do you trust me?" I asked in a soft tone. "With my life, baby," she replied. her full lips quivering. "Then trust me when I say that Jim and his friends will never touch you again," I said with a smile, looking into her deep brown eyes. "Thank you, Boo. Can you tell me exactly what you're going to do to get them to leave us alone?" she asked. How the hell could I answer that? Lie? Be even more vague than I had been already. Granted, the orders of protection for Letitia against the a-holes had been made permanent after Jim's threat against me and my wife. But she was still worried that they would do something to us. What could I tell her that would both pacify her and not make her think I was a monster? She sensed my hesitation. "What are you going to do, baby?" she asked, a worried look coming over her beautiful face again. "There's a reason why I didn't ask for an order of protection for myself, sweetheart," I said quietly. "I want them in a certain place at a certain time. Jeffrey is helping me with that. The rest of them were all aboard with Jim's plan from the beginning. They need to be dealt with permanently." Her eyes went wide at that. "You're going to kill them?" she exclaimed. I just nodded. "I love you too much to let them near you again, Letitia. I can't just stand by and let them run free. They could catch you at the grocery store, or going to and from work. Jim is the mastermind, so I'm sure they won't come after you or me before he gets out." My voice cracked as I shuddered. Yes, I had considered what might happen to me if I killed them. When I killed them, it wasn't a factor. But what if I enjoyed it too much? What if after I killed them, I wanted to kill more people? They deserved it for assaulting my wife and pretty much getting away with it. But what if someone else wronged my wife or me in some trivial way? What then? I had considered all of those things. And if worse came to worst, I would give up everything I had to keep Letitia out of harm's way. There was only one solution for that problem. I had talked to Malcolm about it during my planning stage. Since he had served in Afghanistan and Iraq and had killed terrorists over there, I asked him what it was like to kill a man. When I had asked him that, he knew what I was planning. He confronted me, and I told him flatly and coldly what I just told Letitia. I would not take chances with her life or leave her open to another assault by those a-holes. I had failed her once, but I would not fail her again. "Man, it ain't your fault that it happened. Hell, you did more than most men would. You took on 5 a-holes to defend Letitia and kicked their butts. That means a lot to us. She's my sister, but she's also your wife. I ain't going to lie to you. Killing a man changes you. It took me a hell of a long time to come to terms with it. Some are better at dealing with it than others. It helps, at least it helped me. If the a-holes we kill are pure evil, I ain't going to tell you not to do it, Steve. As far as I'm concerned, you'll be doing the world a favor. What I am telling you, and you'd best listen, is that you need to consider everything very carefully. Consider what it will do to you. Consider how it might affect Tisha. Are you going to tell her?" He finally took a breath. He had just read me the riot act and told me that he wasn't going to stop me. At the same time, he said, "If she asks me flat out, I won't lie to her. I just hope she can understand what I have to do." "I'm glad you do," at least I smiled wryly. Up until a few months ago, Malcolm still hadn't warmed up to me, even though Letitia and I had been together for 6 years and married for 4 of those. "Well, I can't say officially that I agree with vigilant justice, Steve. But from what you've said and from what I know of Jim's gang already, I know that if you need a hand with anything, you let me know." He nodded, basically just telling me that he would help me with whatever my plan might be. "Thanks, Mal. I can't let you do that, though. If this all comes apart on me, I can't be responsible for getting you into trouble," I said, then reached over and shook his hand. "It means a lot to me that you'd do that, though." He grinned. "Brother, I know I didn't give you a fair shake for a number of years, but I respect the man you are now. I've always been this man, Mal. I would die before I let some a-hole hurt Letitia again. Thanks for understanding." "Not a problem, man. Hell, I'd be lying if I said I didn't want to deal with those scumsuckers myself. You feel me?" "Yes, sir." "Okay, I'd better get back to work. "Catch you later," he said with a smile, and we shook hands again. Now here I was, hoping and praying that Letitia would at least understand what I had to do. It broke my heart to see the look of sadness and fear on her face. "What about the restraining order?" she asked. "It's just a slip of paper. It won't stop bullets, and it won't stop him from getting to you when there aren't any cops around either," I replied with conviction, shaking my head slowly. "You heard his threat, sweetheart. You already know what he's capable of, and I won't give him another chance to get to you. I can't. Besides, what if he and his buddies go after some other woman too? What then? You know as well as I do that there's a high probability they'll assault some other woman, and I can't allow that either. I'd rather have 5 scumbags' deaths on my conscience than another assault at their hands. Their parents would just buy them out of trouble again." We were still in an embrace, but Letitia gently pushed back from me and stood there with her hands on her hips. She was shaking her head slowly as she thought about everything I just said. Until all this had started, I never thought I'd want to kill someone, much less 5 people. I never thought I'd feel so much hatred for anyone. I hadn't even been planning to kill them until Jim made his threat against us. She looked up and opened her eyes as her gaze focused on mine. Our eyes locked as she stepped forward, reached up, and pulled my face down so our lips met in a soft kiss. The steely determination was back in her voice as she spoke. "Avenge our baby, Stephen," she said, her voice almost cracking. "Do what you have to do. I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart," I said softly. We went to bed together that night and just held each other as we fell asleep. Well, Letitia fell asleep. I couldn't. I stared at the ceiling, my mind running through every possible scenario that could go wrong when dealing with the a-holes. By the time I finally fell asleep somewhere around 3 a.m., I felt that I had planned for pretty much any contingency. The kill zone was prepared as best as it could be. Jeffrey was scared out of his mind, since he didn't know how I knew so much about him turning on his frat bro buddies during the police interrogation. I didn't come right out and say it, but I left him with the distinct impression that I knew his every move. The stage was set, and the final act was about to begin. The next weekend, on Sunday afternoon, Jeffrey called me and told me that he had contacted all the a-holes, including Jim, and had informed them just as I'd instructed. "They'll be at the warehouse in an hour, Steve," he said nervously. "I'm about to leave to join them." "They bought it." "Good," I responded neutrally. I dressed in jeans, a t-shirt, a windbreaker, and steel-toed boots. All of those clothes would be burned before the day was over, but that was okay with me. I looked up to see Letitia standing there. "Is it time?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. I rose to my feet and took her in my arms again. "No matter what happens, sweetheart, always remember that I love you." "I love you too, honey. Just please be careful and come back to me," she said with a sad smile as a tear rolled down her face. I wiped her cheek gently. "No more tears, baby. These sons of bitches deserve everything they're going to get today." "Yes, they do. But do you?" she asked. "Do you really believe that you can live with what you're about to do? To protect you and avenge our child?" "Yes," I replied gently. "I have it set up already, but I need to go. I have to be there to spring the trap." She chuckled at that. "Go get him, tiger." I gave her a soul-searing kiss, our tongues dancing passionately before pulling away and grabbing the large gym bag full of the items I would be using. "I will, baby," I nodded, then turned and walked out to my waiting Mustang. As I fired up the V8 in my pale horse, I once again thought of Revelation 6-8. I smirked, realizing the analogy. I had become death, at least as far as these a-holes were concerned. I drove the speed limit to the old abandoned warehouse and parked on the opposite side from where the a-holes would enter. I made sure my car was well hidden, as I didn't want them to see it and know the game was up. When I slipped inside, I climbed to the catwalks and maneuvered around to where the a-holes would hopefully be parking their cars. My gym bag sat beside me as I watched out the old grimy window. I glanced at it to check my equipment. A long-range taser with 2 barbed prongs, a stun gun for up close, 3 rolls of duct tape, 1,000,001 uses, a box of latex gloves, 1 pair of which I was already wearing since before I entered the warehouse, a good old Louisville Slugger baseball bat, a pair of vice grips, a medium-sized pair of bolt cutters, a small acetylene blowtorch, and, last but not least, a small remote for when all of the a-holes were where I wanted them to be. I looked out the window and saw a car pulling into the office lot across the street. It was Jeffrey. He got out of his vehicle and leaned against it as he lit a cigarette. The next to arrive was Darren, who parked right beside Jeffrey. He also exited his vehicle and shook hands with his frat brother. They started talking, and Jeffrey appeared nervous. Darren was a big guy, but luckily, he didn't catch on to Jeffrey's nervousness. Jack and Larry arrived together in the same minivan. When they moved over to talk with Jeffrey and Darren, my snitch seemed to become less nervous. Last to arrive, of course, was Jim. Once he hugged and shook hands with his assault crew, Jeffrey showed them across the street and inside the warehouse to where I had arranged the next phase to happen. They climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, and I could overhear Jeffrey speaking. I know for a fact that he doesn't have anyone watching this place. I checked it out already. Wait, that scum sucker has been watching you? Jim asked. Yeah, I think he's worried that we'll go after his wife again. Jeffrey laughed nervously. Don't worry. I took a roundabout route here and kept checking behind me. Nobody followed me. They better not have. Darren spoke up. They didn't. It's one reason I picked this place. It's isolated, and we can talk freely here. I found several bugs in my apartment. Dan, that head must be paranoid or something, Jeffrey said. Doesn't matter now. I got an idea on how to pull this off, Jim said. With that, they stepped into the 2nd floor office. Step into my parlor, said the spider to the fly. I muttered as I pressed the red button on the remote control. 3 things happened simultaneously. The door to the office slammed shut and locked. The floodlights I had installed went on full blast, and the 6 Duralast gold car batteries simultaneously sent 12 volts at 50 amps into the metal floor of the office for 4 seconds each. I didn't want to kill them, yet, just knock them cold. Once that was done, I moved to the office door, which had unlatched and unlocked itself when I let up on the remote button. I quickly moved inside and hauled each a-hole into a metal chair that was sitting in a semicircle. Once in the chair, I duct-taped their wrists to the chair arms and their ankles to the front chair legs. I used up a full roll of tape and about 1/3 of a second roll. When I was done, they were well and truly tied up and would only be released if, or when I decided to. I made sure to check all their pockets and found a .32 in Jim's jacket pocket. That was a windfall. It had 6 shots in the magazine. Then I left the office and came back with another chair, which I sat in to wait for the a-holes to wake up. The first to come around was Jim. He looked at my grim smile and started yelling. Let me go, you little. Face me in a fair fight instead of sucker punching me, and we'll see who the better man is. He snarled loudly. If you hadn't assaulted my wife, you sorry stain, none of this would even be happening. You do realize that, right? I said, my voice now permanently below absolute zero. As you can see, you're tied too tight to get loose. Oh, and I have your little toy here. I showed him his little .32, now held securely in my latex gloved hand. Listen, man, we can negotiate here. Nobody has to die, he replied, changing tone rather quickly once he realized how much trouble he was in. My unborn child didn't have to die either. But the overdose of narcotics you gave my wife before you a-holes assaulted her caused her to lose our baby, I said, rising from my chair. I pressed the barrel of the gun between his eyes. A .32 isn't that great of a pistol. Very little stopping power and not very accurate. However, since you have hollow points in here, I seriously doubt you'd survive if I shot you right between your eyes." Tears were rolling down his face as he started begging for his life. "Please, man, we didn't know she was pregnant, or we never would have done it. I swear on my mama's grave." He lied. "You knew. All of you knew, you goddamn son of a bitch. Besides, your mama is still alive. Since you killed my child, I might just go kill her after I'm finished with you assholes." I snarled again. "You have absolutely no clue what it's like to be given the greatest gift on earth, the news that you're going to be a father, then have that gift ripped from you barely a week later to you," I shouted. The goddamn son of a bitch himself was now crying and pleading for his life. It didn't matter how much noise I made or how loud they screamed. The soundproofed office would ensure that nobody came looking to check it out. Besides, the property security guard only came by on Wednesdays and Saturdays to check on the property itself. The open gate was never closed, and the holes in the fence were never repaired. When I pulled the gun back from Jim's forehead, I moved back and looked around. The rest of the crew was waking up, including my snitch. I looked back at Jim's blubbering face. "How do you think I knew you'd be here, Jimbo? Come on, you're a smart guy. You can figure it out." Jim looked confused for a moment. Then dawning recognition caused his eyes to widen. He shot a look of pure venom at Jeffrey. Jeffrey cringed from the glare. "Oh, don't blame poor Jeffrey," I said. "He really had no choice in the matter. I promised to let him live as long as he was useful to me. I have to say that he was very useful. He kept me abreast of when you were getting out of jail and set this all up on my behalf." I then looked at Jeffrey. "Unfortunately, Jeffrey, I'm afraid I have to let you go." Bang! The bullet splattered Jeffrey's brains all over the wall. I looked at the stunned faces of the other assaulters. "Oh, don't look so shocked. As a reward for his help, I decided to make his end quick and relatively painless. I also spared him the horror of seeing each of his friends die. You all know why you're here, right?" I shouted. None of them said a word, so I explained it to them in small words even they could understand. "You're all here because you assaulted my wife. But that's not the reason you're all going to die. You're going to die because not only did you give my wife a potentially lethal dose of narcotics, but you also caused Letitia to have a miscarriage. That drug caused my wife, who you all knew was pregnant, to lose the most precious thing in the world to us. That is why you're going to die," I shouted. My original plan had been to torture all of them, make them scream until their vocal cords gave out, and then finish them off. But then I realized that I couldn't do it. I was able to kill the scum suckers, but I couldn't torture them. I figured they'd get enough torture in hell. And when I died, I'd see them there. So with Jeffrey dead, I pointed the little 32 at Darren. "Please, man, it was all Jim's idea," he pleaded, trying to throw Jim under the bus. "But you went along with it willingly enough, didn't you? You assaulted my wife along with all your frat brothers. You contributed to my wife losing our baby." Bang! His head snapped backward, a thin stream of blood briefly spouting from his forehead. I didn't hesitate but aimed my pistol at Jack. Bang! Out went his lights. Larry was begging and crying, but I couldn't afford to let his pleas get to me. My wife couldn't even beg you to stop since she was unconscious the whole time. Bang! Bang! One to the chest, one to the head. 5 shots gone. Only one left. "And you weren't carrying a spare magazine," I said to Jim in a conversational tone. "I tell you what, asshole, wait right there." I walked out of the office and unhooked the car batteries from the leads on the underside of the floor. Then I went back inside the office, pulled the stun gun from the gym mag, and hit Jim with enough volts and amps to knock him clean out. Then I undid the duct tape from his wrists and ankles and drew my own pistol, a Springfield XD-40, from the back of my belt, below the windbreaker I wore. Once it was in my hand, I placed his little 32 right beside his hand, then stepped back toward the door. It was only a few moments before he came around. He saw the pistol and grabbed it. "Think very carefully before you decide to use that last bullet, asshole," I said coldly. He froze as he saw the big bore of the 40s and auto pistol pointed at his head. "You giving me a chance?" he asked hopefully. "If you want to call it that. This pistol is unregistered, since a friend of mine bought it in Arizona. That means the cops don't have any ballistics on record for it. That pistol, on the other hand, was bought off the street, probably from a gang member. Am I close?" Jim's eyes grew wide as I was speaking. "That's what I thought. Don't say anything, Jimbo. Just listen. You have one shot left in that gun. Now, from the carnage already in here, you're looking at consecutive life sentences for killing your own crew. Maybe even the death penalty, since you killed them while they were tied to their chairs. Now you can take the chance that the cops will believe you, a guy with a rap sheet a mile long, or you can run. No, wait. Actually, you can't run from this. You see, I just used a burner phone to call in an anonymous tip that shots were fired, and I saw a large man entering the warehouse shortly before said shots were fired. I gave them your exact description. You just got out of jail this morning, asshole. What do you think the cops are going to think?" Jim looked at the gun in his hand, then at my own gun, aimed steadily between his eyes. "You won't get away with this," he snarled at me. "You have two choices, Jim. You can shoot me, or you can use the bullet on yourself. Since when I leave this office, the door will close and lock automatically. Sure, the cops will have to bust it down when they get here, but I seriously doubt they'll believe your story." With that, I backed out of the room, my gym bag over my shoulder, and the gun still pointed at Jim's forehead. He was frozen in place until, once outside, I hit the button that closed and locked the office door. I stood there for a good 10 minutes, then shrugged and turned to leave. As I did, I heard a muffled shot from inside the office. I turned back and looked inside. Jim had the gun in his mouth, and the back of his head was a bloody mess. Oh well, he never realized that I was bluffing about calling the cops. It would be Wednesday at the earliest, most probably, before he and his crew were discovered by the property security guard. I then removed everything I had rigged up, starting with the car batteries, then the automatic door closer, opener, and auto lock. Once all of that was done, I lugged it all out to my car and threw it in the trunk. Once that was done, I realized how strangely calm I was. I drove home on autopilot, still numb from what I had done, and the choice I'd left for Jim. If he had aimed his gun at me, I would have blown his brains out with the hollow points in the XD. I knew it was a risk, but I also knew that Jim, at his core, was an arrogant, selfish prick who wasn't nearly as smart as he thought he was. He'd done 90 days in county. He wouldn't have lasted nearly as long if he had been in federal prison. When I parked in the driveway and lugged my bag inside, I finally allowed myself to feel something. The door was barely closed before I fell to my knees and hung my head. The fatigue hit me like a Mack truck as my whole body shook. "Baby," Letitia said tentatively as she came into the living room from the kitchen. "Yeah, I'm here," I said shakily. "Oh my God, Boo," she cried out as she fell to her knees with me, throwing her arms around my neck and holding me tightly as I finally lost the last hold on my emotions. I had never killed anyone before, but in the space of a few minutes, I had taken 4 lives and then basically forced a man to take his own life, in addition to my own 4 counts of first-degree murder. "Hold on, baby," she said softly, then got her cell phone and dialed a number. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but if she was calling the cops to come get me, I wouldn't have blamed her. I looked at my wife with tears in my eyes. "It's done," I whispered as she ended the call. "I know, baby. It's okay. Everything's going to be okay," she said, her own tears threatening to fall. She held me close again, and I clung to her as if she was my only lifeline. "They can't hurt you or anyone else anymore, sweetheart," I said as I held her close. "Sha, baby, it's okay. Come on over to the table. I have dinner ready, and I cooked your favorite." So saying, she stood up, and I stood up with her, holding her hand as she led me to the dining room. Once I was seated, I heard the front door opening and closing, and I turned to see Malcolm coming toward me with a concerned look on his face. "Don't worry, man. Whatever happens, it ain't coming back on you," he said as he clapped me on the shoulder. "I've been there, so if you need to talk, I'm here for you. Family comes first, brother, and your family." So I confessed everything to my brother-in-law and my wife. I felt a weight lift from me as I unburdened my soul. Malcolm listened intently, as did Letitia. She hugged me close after I finished, kissing me softly. "Thank you, Steve," Malcolm said with a nod of respect. Life slowly got back to normal. I had plenty of vacation time accrued at work, so I took all 4 weeks of it, and Letitia took 4 weeks of vacation with me. We went to Hawaii for a second honeymoon, and I was finally able to find peace with what I'd done. Letitia also knew that I would never do anything like that again unless something horrible happened to her or our baby. That's right. When we arrived home from our vacation in Hawaii, she started getting morning sickness again. A quick trip to her OB/GYN let us know that she was indeed pregnant, but that we would have to be careful, as the miscarriage had increased her chances of losing the baby this time around too. However, we were happy. For the first time in a long time, we had laid the demons to rest, both figuratively and literally. Malcolm was as good as his word. Nothing came back on me from the murders in the warehouse. The official story was that Jim had most likely found out that Jeffrey was a rat and started suspecting the rest of his crew too. In a fit of paranoia, he killed them all. Then, when he realized what he'd done, he turned the gun on himself. When I heard about all the other things he and his gang had done in college, I felt really justified in what I'd done. It seems that Letitia wasn't their first assault, that like this time, the previous incidents had been swept under the rug. They had never spent any length of time in jail, and no time in prison whatsoever. Malcolm was able to dig deep into their past, and the fallout from what I'd done was nicely diverted. The mayor and police chief had called it a multiple murder-suicide by Mr. James Gables, and nobody questioned it. Did I murder them? I guess it all depends on how you look at it. They were college frat boys who never grew up or learned from their mistakes. I only hope that, in the end, they realized just how much they'd hurt others, and that they would spend the rest of eternity in hell. Oh, as for Amanda Ramirez, she had her own troubles. When things came to a head, her connection to the assault gang was confirmed after an anonymous tip to the DA's office. After an intense investigation, she came clean about fudging things in their favor to get them the plea deals, and was subsequently disbarred and charged. She was tried and convicted of several conspiracy charges stemming from her contact with the now-deceased a-holes. She was given 10 years in prison when all was said and done. I hope she likes eating carpet now. Here I sit with my wife beside me as we watch TV, her belly showing how close she is to having our baby daughter. Life is good now. She still works for Walker Advertising, but I left the data entry firm and started my own business. I've had some pretty famous clients so far, and word has spread about my ability to build good computers at way less than retail. Thank you, Fry's Electronics. I rub Letitia's belly as I lean over and kiss her. I love you, sweetheart. I love you too, honey, she replies. Yes, life is indeed good. I love my wife and daughter, and would do anything to protect them. If that means that my soul itself is the price, then so be it. But unless or until that happens, the horsemen will rest. I pray that they are never needed again. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.